And today what we're going to do for our 4-H sewing project is we're going to take one of these handkerchiefs and we're going to turn it into a little headkerchief and something to go around the neck of your dog. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to press our handkerchief or bandana. And the way you want to do it is you want to make sure you're pressing down rather than just ironing across. Because if you notice on this piece of fabric, if I go to pull it this way, it doesn't pull very far. And if I go to pull it this way, it doesn't go so far. But if I pull it on the diagonal, it really has a lot of stretch to it. And so if you're ironing, particularly on the diagonal, you can take this square piece of fabric and you can turn it into a really offset parallelogram. And that becomes very important when you're ironing, when you're pressing clothes or fancy items that you might be, more advanced pieces that you're sewing later. This is a good beginner's project because it's really forgiving. It's not an exact square to begin with. It was just factory produced, but we learn a lot of skills in this project. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find the bias of this. And the bias is called the diagonal. And that's the place where you have that stretchier fabric. And we're going to be making some bias tape too. But see, if I fold it in the diagonal, it's not perfect. So we're not going to worry about that too much. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to press down here on the diagonal, on the bias. There's so much new vocabulary in sewing. And then we're going to cut with a rotary cutter. And when you work with a rotary cutter, this is a special mat that goes underneath it because the rotary blade is really very sharp. And I just pressed so that I would get a nice straight guideline. There's guides here, a grid on this mat, but we just want to, this isn't too exact. And then if I'm sliding along, my ruler isn't long enough to go all the way across, so I'm going to do a little trick. And I'm going to line up this crease here as best as I can. It's all going to end up in the seam allowance. But the rotary cutter can cut through two pieces of fabric very easily. And this is a left or a right-handed cutter. So for my right-handed sewers, you're going to want to work on the right side of your ruler. And you can just flip it over for my little lefty here. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll line this up here. And we'll just slice here. And I didn't quite go all the way through, but that's okay. That happens all the time. To me, anyway. Okay. So this piece will work for us, for our head. And then I'm going to keep this folded over, and I'm going to use my grid lines here because we're going to make some bias tape. I'm cutting the fabric on the diagonal of that bandana so it has some good stretch. And what I want to do is I want to find a 3-inch mark so that we'll get some nice wide bias tape to work with. And I'll cut here. I did it! It works out sometimes. Always close this up right away because these are super sharp. So now, this is what we're going to make our bias tape from. And you want to take this and we're going to fold it in half. Press it down. And then I'm going to open that up and I'm going to fold into that center seam again. So I'm folding. I fold it in half and then I fold it in half again. So that way when we're going over the outside edge of our pot holder that we'll be doing later, we'll be using bias tape for a lot of our projects. And you can definitely buy bias tape at the store, but for some projects, it just looks better to make your own, and it's pretty easy to do. Especially for maybe some of the older members of our project. But it's handy to have a pack around just for some of the things that we'll be making. And then when I folded these pieces into the center, it kind of looks like a necktie, doesn't it? I flattened out that center piece, so I'll fold it back again. I want to make sure that as I'm sliding the iron along, I'm not really dragging my iron until I go to press it down and push that steam. So now if you look here, this was folded in half. And then what we're going to do is we'll bring up our board again. And we're just going to cut this in half because these are going to be the ties on our neckerchief. You could just cut this with scissors also. There we go. Do you hear my dog? He's going crazy out there. Okay, so now this smaller one is going to be for your dog. And we don't have to be too exact about it, but we want to make sure that there are no raveling raw edges in your project. So we're going to fold it over and press it down. And then we're going to fold it one more time, because if we just made a seam here, if we just hemmed that up, it would start to fray. We want to give this a good professional look. And you know your dog's going to be chewing on this too. Save this for later. And we're going to do the same thing on this big piece. And I'm not going to be too exact. We could use a ruler, we could use our seam gauge and really mark this to get a nice exact line. But I noticed that my bandana wasn't a perfect square to begin with. And so it would be kind of futile to try to make this into a perfect triangle. So I'm not going to bother. Fold it over one more time so that when we make our seam, I'm not making this too small because we're just beginning, and it takes practice to get your seams nice and straight. And if you notice, most of this video, most of what we're doing is the prepping. It's the pressing, cutting, pinning. The sewing is, you're spending less time sewing than all of this prep work. It's really important, and when this part is done correctly, the sewing is easy. So you have to pay attention to this part to have good looking pieces. So now we'll go over to the sewing machine and we'll whip it all up. Project. And the first one I'm going to do is that little piece, that little doggy bandana. And I have measured with my seam gauge here, and I know on my particular presser foot that when I use the edge of my presser foot as a guide, I am making a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to, as my goal, try to make a 1/4 inch seam here. And I'm going to start very slowly, back stitch so that I don't unravel my seam. I go. And we've got plenty of room here, but if you get a little wiggly. And then we always want to make sure we cut our threads. And these are with those special sewing scissors we talked about, not for paper. Can you tell what one of my big pet peeves are? Who took my sewing scissors? Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to pull our thread back thread about 5 inches or so. We're going to come near the edge here. We'll back stitch for practice. We're going to be adding seam bias tape to the edge here, but we'll practice back stitching anyway because it's such a good habit. I thought this nice big one would be good for us, but since we're adding a tie to it, I think this is the one that will be good. I'm designing as I go here. I think this is going to be a good one to give to a friend or have your dog wear. The one with the tie, I just changed my mind. It's going to be this smaller one. That's a much better size. And so now what we're going to do with our bias tape that we made is one side is cut straight where we cut it in the center. So this is the part. In class I called it, we open it up like a taco shell. Remember I was talking about stuffing a taco, filling a taco. We're going to fold that over like that. And then we'll pin it. I'm going to have you guys take out your pins as you go because it's the safest way. What's up with these pins? There we go. So we'll just mark that with one pin. And then we'll mark it on the other side as well. And just fill that in. Just like so. Pin that. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to do this 2 places. First I'm going to take it right across the edge at the end of that bias tape. And I'm just going to back stitch the whole way. I'm going to go all the way across and back stitch all the way. And then I'm just going to go a few stitches in and leave that needle down, lift my presser foot, and I'm going to pivot it. Now I tried to get it close to the edge of my presser foot. Sometimes it works. But now that seam just anchored the bias piece on, so I don't need my pin anymore, and that's the safest way for a beginner to work. And now we're just going to do our 1/4 inch seam all the way to the end. Let's stop here and straighten that up. Nice and loose. Sometimes the bobbin is locked into a position where it doesn't really want to turn. So you can just adjust it by turning that little dial. Always cut the threads carefully and as close to the edge as you can. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. Threads everywhere. Okay, I think I pinned a little too close. Where I'm going to sew. I'm going to put this down right near the edge of where my bias, the end of my bias tape where it overlaps the corner of the bandana. And I'm going to go all the way across, holding onto that thread to kind of guide it. And then I'm just going to go into reverse and back stitch all the way to the back. And then I'll come out a few stitches, pivot it. Wasn't exact, but as I sew I can guide that on over. And then this right here is kind of hanging out a little bit, but I can push that into my taco shell. Here we go. Full speed ahead. At the end, release the thread, cut our seams, or cut our thread, don't cut your seams. Your piece will fall apart if you do that, and voila! You have a nice little headscarf, little tie underneath. Bye you guys, see you next time.